Welcome to the preaching ministry of First Cumberland Presbyterian Church of Chattanooga. This recording is simply the sermon portion of our worship service. To experience our full worship service, we encourage you and invite you to join us Sunday morning at 11 in our beautiful sanctuary located at 1505 North Moore Road.
Our scripture passage today is the wonderful beginning to a wonderful story, the story of Ruth. I'll be reading from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrodites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So he said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, even more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. My brothers and sisters in Christ, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, a few weeks ago, we hosted a few refugee families at our farm for an afternoon of horseback riding and for a dinner. A couple of families came from Central and South America, and then there were a couple of families who had just arrived here from Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is on all of our hearts because of the war that is going on there. And I knew that wasn't the time or the place to talk with them about that. And so I simply said to them, "I know this has been such a terrible, terrible year for you, and I'm so very, very sorry. But I'm glad that you are here." And one of the women, the mothers, responded back to me, "It has been such a hard year, and we are so thankful that we are here. We are so thankful to be here." But then she said something very interesting to me. She said, "But we really hope that one day we will be able to go home again." And it occurred to me that as wonderful as it is for them to be here and for them to be safe, for them to have ministries like the Neighbors Ministry here in Chattanooga that is caring for them, there really is no place like home, to quote from The Wizard of Oz. And they do want to go back home. And refugees around the world for centuries, for thousands of years, have had those similar feelings. We're glad that we're safe. We're glad that we're here, but we really hope that we can go back home. That is certainly the case in this morning's story. It is a story about refugees, fleeing not war, but fleeing a famine. Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons flee Israel, and they flee not to a friendly country, but actually to an ancient enemy of Israel, Moab. They may be greeted there with some hostility or suspicion, and yet I am sure while they were there, they were thankful that in Moab they didn't starve. But surely there always was for them this dream of returning home, this dream of getting to go back home. Well, unfortunately, Elimelech dies before that dream can come to fruition. And one commentator that I read this week wondered if perhaps he didn't die of a broken heart or die almost of shame. Here he is, a man who wants to support his family, who wants to care for his family, and he's unable to support them back at home. And he has to take them into a land that is a land traditionally known of as a land of enemies. And he has to come into that land with his hand out, asking for help, and maybe that caused him just to die of shame. After he dies, his two sons both marry Moabite women, and Naomi was likely not particularly supportive of this initially. Her sons having Moabite wives were going to add to her troubles when she went back home. She knew that people would look askance at them. And there's a sense in which we know that Naomi had always dreamed of her boys meeting and marrying nice Jewish girls, and now they have these Moabite wives. And yet, obviously, both Orpah and Ruth come to become very, very close to Naomi, and they truly are a family. Naomi hears that it is time, that they can return back to Israel. The famine has passed. It's been 10 long years, and yet before they can go back, both of the boys die. We don't know what they died of, but we know that they are now gone, and so Naomi is the only one who fled from Bethlehem, who fled from Israel, who is now preparing to go back. And initially, Orpah and Ruth go with her, but then Naomi, I think in a burst of wonderful kindness, says to them, don't come after me, don't come with me. There's nothing for you in Israel. You're going to have trouble finding husbands there. You're going to essentially be refugees there, just like I've always been a refugee here. I can't give you husbands. I'm too old to bear any more sons. You stay here with your people, and you stay here at home, and I'll go and be at home with my people. Well, Orpah kisses her, and Orpah goes, and she returns to her people. And I don't think we should be critical of Orpah. Many of us would do exactly the same. It really is the logical, rational thing to do. And yet we are told that Ruth clings to Naomi. Ruth will not go. Ruth is different. And then Ruth offers this beautiful poem that we often get heard at weddings or sometimes at other times when people are making commitments. And it's this beautiful, beautiful poem in which Ruth says, do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. When you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and more to me as well, if even death parts me from you. And part of what she means there at the end is, if I am buried with you, even my bones will be interred with your bones. My home now will be Israel. In a sense, Moab is no longer home. And so even at death, I will remain with you. She's making a huge commitment, a lifelong and even beyond commitment. And at that moment, she cannot possibly know that she is going to meet, I suppose, the second love of her life in Israel, in Boaz. She obviously cannot possibly know that centuries and centuries later, when Matthew is writing his gospel, Ruth will be one of only 5 women that Matthew includes in his long genealogy of Jesus. At this moment, all Ruth knows is that Naomi needs her, and she makes a commitment to care for her as long as she lives. I think this is a reminder that God often asks us to make commitments, and they are lifelong commitments. Anytime we make a long-term commitment, it's not going to be easy. There's going to be plenty of things that we have to do that we may not want to do. Ruth may not have wanted really to go to Israel, but she knew she needed to in order to care for Naomi. I think this also reminds us that when we make these long-term commitments, we need to look to God for help. how powerful it is that Ruth indeed says, your God will be my God. And then I think it's important for us to note that when we make and keep these long-term commitments, we may find that we get blessed beyond our imaginations, as indeed Ruth was. John Goldingay is an Old Testament scholar. And shortly before he married the love of his life, her name was Anne. Anne was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, with MS. And the doctor said, you are going to have a perhaps long, maybe quick decline, and most likely eventually MS will kill you. And this was John's opportunity actually to get out. He didn't sign up for that. He was looking for the love of his life. He was looking for a wife. He wasn't looking for a patient. He wasn't looking for somebody to care for. And I don't know if they had a conversation like that, but surely he could have walked away at that moment. He had not yet made that commitment to her. But instead, indeed, they did get married. And he did commit to her, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. And from her diagnosis, she began a very slow but continuously progressive decline. They lived together, were married for 43 years. It was a long time, and yet Anne kept losing functions of different things that she was able to do, and the things that they were able to do early in their marriage very quickly fell apart. It did not take too terribly long before she could not walk anymore. And then eventually it got to be where she couldn't get into and out of the bed without help. Eventually it got to be where she could not speak, and then she could not even eat. And toward the end of her life, she couldn't make any response at all. And yet John cared for her and loved her all of those 43 years. At one point during a particularly bad time when Anne was going through a particularly difficult flare-up and was unable to eat, he couldn't have classes at the school where he was teaching. He had to ask the students to come to his house so that he could care for her there in the house. And as he is teaching them, and this particular course he was teaching them was about how faithful God is in the Old Testament and the ways that in the Old Testament God is always faithful and caring for the people even when they don't deserve it, even when it's difficult. And he's teaching them these lessons, and they're watching him also simultaneously care for Anne right there in the room with them. And John didn't realize what he was doing, but his students did. He was giving them, without realizing it, a parable for just the way that God cares for us. When we have no one else to care for us, when no one else maybe would want to care for us, when it's hard to care for us, God still cares for us. In our helpless estate, God is there with us, and that was what he was doing for her. Probably those actions taught the students more about God's love and care and commitment than even all of the lectures that he gave them as he was caring for Anne there. I think that both John and Ruth's stories are commitments, and they tell us about commitments to family, but we also need to recognize God calls us to other lifelong commitments as well. We all are called to a lifelong commitment to God's church and to care for the church and to serve the church and to be on mission with the church during the good times and also when it's difficult. Some of us are called to lifelong commitments to friends, and sometimes those are friends that seem to have problem after problem after problem, and yet we are called to be there for them, to walk with them through all of those problems. Some are called to a lifelong commitment to a particular profession or a particular ministry or a particular cause. And we know, as I already mentioned, that we cannot succeed at those commitments if we do not rely on the wonderful power and grace of God. And let's be honest, some of us actually fail at those commitments. We may fail from time to time. We may utterly fail in those commitments. When we do, we then must turn to the wonderful, amazing grace of God and know that even though we made a commitment and maybe failed it, God can forgive us for that. And there is still work that God has for us to do. So has commitments for us to make. But I think this story is not totally about gigantic commitments, or it cannot teach us only about the gigantic commitments that we are to make, but maybe also about making smaller commitments. Before we pledge ourselves, wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. And your people will be my people. Maybe we take smaller steps. Even in this case, this comes at the end of Ruth and Naomi knowing each other for at least 10 years. So at the end of a decade that Ruth makes this commitment. We make smaller commitments and can be blessed in the smaller commitments, or perhaps the smaller commitments can take us to even further and deeper commitments. We never know. We trust God and follow those commitments anyway. Back in the fall of 2020, all of us, to one degree or another, were locked in and isolated due to the pandemic. Some people put up Christmas decorations in October because they said, things are so dark right now, I just need the light and the joy of the Christmas season a little earlier and a little longer this year. For other people, though, Christmas coming was just a reminder of how isolated and lonely they felt. One of those people was a woman in Baltimore named Morton. She was locked down in her home, and the pandemic had not only made her feel isolated and lonely, but it had exacerbated some of her other problems. She suffered from anxiety, and seeing the constant bad news on the television about the pandemic and not being able to get out and do the things that she used to do caused her to have a number of anxiety attacks right there in her house. She suffered from depression, and the pandemic just sunk her to even deeper levels of depression. And one day she happened to post on Facebook just how much she was struggling. Her across-the-street neighbor is a man named Matt Riggs, and he knew Kim a little bit, but not well, just basically know her as a neighbor to speak when they would come out to the mailbox or to bring the trash out or whatever. But he read that on Facebook, and he thought, what can I do? What can I do to help my neighbor across the street? And he thought, well, I can't throw a Christmas party because nobody would come, nobody could come. And I can't even invite her to come to dinner at my house or something because, again, we're not supposed to be getting that close and having that much close contact. And that might cause her anxiety to flare up anyway. And then all of a sudden, he developed just a wonderful, wonderful idea. And he went to the store and he got lots and lots and lots of strings of Christmas lights. And he went back home and went out, and he was able to put the lights up in a tree in his house, but then run the lights across the street and into a tree in at her house, in her front yard. And the lights were up high enough that they wouldn't impede traffic. And then he made some homemade cookies, and he put the cookies on her front porch, and he went back and he turned on the lights, and then he called her, and he said, Kim, if you don't mind, just step out onto your front porch. There's a little surprise there for you. And she stepped out onto the front porch, and there was a plate of cookies, and there were lights running from his house across to hers, from at least from the tree in his yard across to the tree in her yard. And she says that the lights literally brightened her world. And they reminded her that no matter how isolated she felt, she wasn't alone. She now had a bright connection, and really a literal connection with those lights, with her neighbor across the street. That isn't the end of the story. The other neighbors saw this and they wondered what was going on. And we can imagine this story taking a dark turn. The homeowners association showing up and saying you can't do that or whatever. But that's not the way that this neighborhood rolls. When they heard what Matt had done, they decided, hey, we can do that too. And so people started stringing lights across from their side of the street to the other side of the street. And then some of the neighbors that would then reciprocate and take them back across the other direction until the entire street was just completely a tunnel of lights that neighbors had done, connecting one another's houses with the lights. And the whole neighborhood now felt connected. But that's not the end of the story either. Greater Baltimore began to discover this, and people began showing up at the neighborhood, driving down the street at night just to get to see this neighborhood that was demonstrating the connection and the love that they had to one another. And that brought some brightness and hope to people who couldn't do much else that Christmas season, but at least could get in the car and go for a little drive. And then 2021 came, and the neighborhood decided to go all out. And so they put up even more lights all the way down the street. And one neighbor made a sign that was all in lights for the very beginning of the street that said, "Love lives here." And again, many, many people from all over Baltimore came to see the neighborhood where love lives, where people are connected. Now, all of that started with just a tiny little commitment that Matt Riggs made to the neighbor across the street whom he hardly knew. And it just started with a fairly small act of kindness. He had to go out of his way a fair amount. He had to bake cookies and buy lights and string lights, but it wasn't the biggest commitment anybody's ever made. And yet, what a difference that made. What a blessing it was for other people. What a blessing I know it was for Matt as well. I think that is exactly the story of Ruth. A story of kindness and commitment. A story of kindness and commitment that Ruth does for Naomi, not knowing that ultimately she is going to be a lesson and an inspiration for all of Israel and for the church that would come after it. Not knowing that she would be a part of Jesus' genealogy, even though she wasn't even a true Israelite. She was a Moabite, and that in itself brings great comfort to all of us, so that we know that indeed the gospel is for everyone. Ruth couldn't know that when she offered kindness and commitment to Naomi, and yet that is exactly what happens. And so that is our reminder that indeed that is the call that God has for us. As I was doing some research and studying for this particular sermon, I came across a phrase that I had never come across before, but I just love it. It was, always be kinder than necessary. And that's exactly what Ruth did. That's exactly what Matt Riggs did. And that's exactly what God is calling us to do. Orpah was very kind to Naomi, and she should be commended for that. But she wasn't kinder than necessary. But Ruth was much, much kinder than necessary. And look at the difference it made. So let us commit ourselves this day, following in the footsteps of Ruth, to always being kinder than necessary, and seeing what God might do with the kindness and the commitment that we show to others. Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this message from the preaching ministry of First Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Once more, we hope you'll join us in person Sunday at 11 a.m. for worship.